Bore da, good morning, and a very warm welcome to the second day of our Green Ambition series, which is taking place this week. The aim of the series is to help you realise your green ambitions by covering a wide variety of subjects, and this morning we're looking at plastics packaging tax. Bore da chi, a chroeso cynnes iawn i'r ail ddiwrnod o'n cyfres gweledigaeth werdd sy'n cael ei chynnal yr wythnos hon. Nod y gyfres yw helpu chi i wireddu eich uchelgeisiau gwyrdd drwy ymryn ag amrywiaeth eang iawn o bynciau. A bore yma, i ni'n edrych ar dreth pecynnu plastig. Just before we get going, I'm going to hand over to TV presenter, author and naturalist Iolo Williams, who's going to officially welcome you to this morning's session. Iolo's welcome is in Welsh with English subtitles, and then the rest of today's session and the rest of the week will be held in English. Wrth gwrs, mae croeso chi gysylltu ni yn Gymraeg drwy ddefnyddio'r cyfleuster cwestiwn ag ateb. You're more than welcome to correspond with us in Welsh if you prefer.
Helo na, a croeso i gyfres y weledigaeth werdd busnes Cymru. Iolo Williams ydw i, a dwi'n falch o gyflwyno'r gyfres ddiddorol hon o ddigwyddiadau a greuwyd i gynorthwyo busnesau i ddod yn fwy effeithlon o ran adnoddau. Os ydych chi, fel finnau, a diddordeb brwd mewn cynaladwyedd ac effaith amgylcheddol, yna bydd y gyfres hon yn darparu arweiniad a chymorth i'ch helpu i wneud newidiadau yn eich busnes. Mae tîm arbenigol Busnes Cymru wrth law i gynnig sesiynau cyngor un i un unigryw. Felly, os ydych chi wedi eich ysbrydoli gan yr hyn a glywch chi heddiw, yna cysylltwch â'r tîm i archebu eich sesiwn rhad ac am ddim, lle bydd cynghorwyr yn eich helpu i fapio'ch gweledigaeth werdd a symud ymlaen tuag at ddod yn fusnes fwy effeithlon o ran adnoddau. Pob lwc a diolch yn fawr i chi.
Diolch yn fawr i Iolo hefyd. Thank you very much, Iolo. And thank you also to Business Wales for organising this event. Business Wales is a free service that provides impartial, independent support and advice to people starting, running and growing a business in Wales. Funded by the Welsh Government and European Regional Development Fund, Business Wales has an excellent track record for providing innovative events just like this week and training sessions. And I have to say personally, apart from doing this kind of work, I have a small business and have been fortunate enough to use the facilities on offer. I think we're very lucky to have Business Wales here in Wales. So this morning's focus is on bit of a tongue twister, plastics packaging tax. And this session will be delivered by industry expert Valpak. And it's going to provide you with a full briefing on the plastic packaging tax, including the businesses that are affected, the thresholds and exemptions, the HMRC implications, and the support available. There'll be an opportunity for live Q&A at the end with Valpak and HMRC joining us. Feel free to post some questions in the question and answer facility during the presentation. And just for you to know, today's presentations have been pre-recorded. And since recording, the order of presentation has changed slightly. So Lee Waring is presenting this morning's session, and then George Atkinson is with us this afternoon.
Hello everybody and welcome to our session on the UK plastic packaging tax. My name is Lee Waring, I am a strategic account manager at Valpak. You've already heard this morning from my colleague George Atkinson. So in this session I'm going to be taking you through the new plastic packaging tax that is going to be coming in this year, quite imminently now, it's less than a month away, and how it affects UK businesses and what to expect as we move into the implementation of the tax next month. So what we're going to be looking at, we're going to look at where we are in the implementation process. As I said, we're pretty close now to this coming into force, so a lot of the implementation process is now behind us. Just to recap what we've been looking at over the last couple of years, and then go into the actual core aspects of the tax. So we'll look at the scope, look at what's in scope, what's out of scope, what types of companies are going to be liable, how you go about evidencing recycled content, because obviously, as we'll see, this tax is all about giving an incentive to businesses to use recycled content, so how you go about doing that. Look at some exemptions and sort of what we're expecting to see from the reporting side of things as well, what you actually have to do when it comes to making your returns to HMRC. We'll talk very quickly at the end about what we're doing to help companies as well. And then, yes, we're also going to have a live Q&A session, which will be basically all the areas we're talking about today, plastic tax, EPR, DRS. We're going to have a live Q&A session with George and myself where you'll be able to ask us questions. So that'll be coming up after we've done the 3 separate sessions. So to start with, we'll look at where we are in terms of the implementation. So the plastic packaging tax, this has been sort of discussed now for a long time, right back at the end of 2019. We've had this basically in the pipeline from HMRC. So we've had a few different proposals as we move through the last couple of years. At the end of 2020, we had the first draft implementing regulations as well. In Q3 last year, we had the Finance Act, which was passed, which basically was setting up ready to bring this into law. And then we had the actual final set of legislation. We got eyes on that towards the end of last year. So we are expecting then the regulations to be implemented in Q1 of this year, ready for the tax to get implemented in April, which say is now less than a couple of weeks away. So in terms of the basics, I appreciate there's probably people on the call that know about this, but yeah, we'll start from the very start for those of you that maybe this is something brand new. So this tax, as I mentioned, is going to come into force from the 1st of April, so in a couple of weeks' time, and that is concerning all plastic packaging that is either manufactured in the UK or is imported into the UK after that date. So from the 1st of April onwards, that's when plastic packaging starts counting towards this tax liability. Anything that you're importing now, anything that you're manufacturing now and have done from the start of this year, it's not going to count. So it's only the stuff that is actually coming into the country and has been made in the country from the 1st of April onwards that is going to be falling under the scope of this tax. The tax is going to apply on a component level. So if you imagine, I've got water bottles here in the picture on this slide, so that's what I tend to use as an example. If you're importing those water bottles, there are probably 3 separate plastic components you have to consider there. You've got the actual bottle itself, you've got a plastic cap, and there's probably a plastic label around the bottle as well. So you're going to have to consider the plastic weights of each of those components, and you're also going to have to assess those plastic components individually against the recycled content threshold that HMRC has set. Now that's been set at 30%. So what we're basically seeing is that businesses that are manufacturing or importing plastic after the 1st of April, you're going to be getting charged £200 per tonne tax unless your plastic packaging components have 30% or more recycled content by weight in each of those plastic components. Now that 30% can't be averaged across multiple packaging components. So you're not looking at the average of the recycled content across all of those components in the water bottle. You have to assess each one individually. So it could be that you are meeting the 30% in the bottle, let's say, but maybe you can't introduce recycled content into the cap or into the label. In that case, if you were to import that product, you're going to be paying your tax liability on the weight of the caps and the labels, but not on the bottle, because the bottle is the one that you are managing to get 30% or more recycled content into. The payments are going to be quarterly to HMRC starting in the 1st of July this year. So as the tax is implemented in April, that's going to give companies a few months to gather the first set of data ready to submit in July. So in July, we're anticipating a business that has to make one of these tax declarations is going to have to declare everything they've imported or manufactured in April, May and June 2022. And as I say, £200 per tonne is going to be the levy that is charged on any of the plastic that gets declared that does not meet that 30% recycled content threshold. Really important to note that this tax is going to apply on top of any current and any future producer compliance regimes as well. So we already have in the UK our PRN system. That's going to get replaced in the very, very near future by the EPR system and the DRS systems that George is talking you through today. So it's really important to know that this tax is always going to apply on top of those other producer compliance regimes. If your plastic packaging is liable for the tax, it's going to have to get declared under a tax submission, and it's also going to have to get declared in a PRN submission as it is now, and in the future under that EPR and DRS systems. In terms of the recycled content, so obviously, as I mentioned, 30% is the level that we're trying to shoot for here. We're trying to make sure that we've got at least 30% recycled content in each of those plastic components in order to actually qualify as recycled content that's enough to basically void your liability for the tax. So it's not good enough for a business just to know that they have that level of recycled content in their plastic packaging. You also have to be able to evidence this. So you're going to have valid documentation from HMRC, that you're going to be able to present to HMRC should they ask for it, that actually proves what the recycled content is going to be in those components. So some of the examples that HMRC have given in their guidance, you've got things such as production specifications, contracts, certificates of conformity, any purchase orders and sales invoices that you've got from suppliers or customers, accreditations, any quality assurance audits that you might be conducting on your supply chain to show that they're using recycled content. These are the types of documentation documents that HMRC are going to expect businesses to have on file to back up that 30% or more recycled content in your plastic components. Now, HMRC are going to allow both pre and post-consumer plastic waste that it can be used as recycled content. So the important clarification here is that any pre-consumer plastic waste, that is things that have sort of come from a manufacturing process, you're not allowed just to pick that scrap up essentially from a production facility's floor, put it back into the same manufacturing process and then claim recycled content on that volume. So it has to have actually gone through a proper reprocessing process. So it needs to have gone to a proper facility, needs to have been properly reprocessed, and then it can be used as recycled content, and you can claim it then as valid recycled content. HMRC have clarified last year that facility doesn't necessarily have to be separate, nor does it necessarily have to be accredited either. But basically, we do have to make sure that any pre-consumer waste has been properly recycled, rather than it just being scrap that is taken from a production process and put back into the same production process. That's not allowed as recycled content. Now, HMRC have clarified that evidence has to state the weight of a recycled plastic in an indicative component, so that it has to be quite specific on these evidence documents. It has to actually state what the recycled content is in those plastic components versus the weight of all of the plastic that's being used in the components. Or say if it's some kind of certificate that shows a production run or something like that, then it has to show the weight of plastic inputs divided by the number of components. So basically, it's not good enough just to have a statement from a supplier saying that they're achieving a certain recycled content. Say it has to actually really be quite specific on the rates that they're using and the materials they're using to generate that recycled content amount. In terms of who is liable in the UK, so we've kind of covered it a little bit in detail already, but just to go into it in more detail, we have two types of liable companies. You've got UK manufacturers, so those are the companies that are going to be producing liable finished plastic packaging in the UK. So that is anybody that's operating a plastic packaging facility, making recognisable finished packaging. Now, the liability, HMRC tell us, rests with the company who performs what they call the last substantial modification. So this is basically the company that is performing the last recognised modification to the plastic component to turn it into a finished item. So we'll look at that in a bit more detail in a slide or two's time. The second type of liable business is anybody who is basically importing or having liable plastic components imported on their behalf into the UK. So again, we're going to talk about this in a bit more detail as well, because we're going to go into who we consider in supply chains is going to be considered the importer, because obviously there are various different Incoterms and then things that people can buy on, and the liabilities for importing and paying other duties can change based on what Incoterms you buy on. But essentially, if you are considered the importer of record, you're the company that's bringing this into the country, then you are going to be counted as the importer, and you're going to have to pick this up as your liability in a declaration. There is a de minimis, so not everybody is going to have to make one of these declarations. If you're a smaller company that are manufacturing or importing less than 10 tons of plastic packaging over a 12-month period, then you're going to be exempt from doing these submissions. You're still probably going to have to keep records. You're going to have to be able to track this and make sure that you're basically aware that you are below that 10-ton threshold. So there's going to have to be an element of data gathering here. But essentially, if you are importing or manufacturing less than 10 tons in that 12-month period, then yeah, you're going to be exempt from having to register with HMRC and make one of these declarations. If you're in a group of businesses, then that 10-ton threshold is going to apply to each individual legal entity within the group separately. So you've got lots of smaller companies within a group all doing a couple of tons here, a couple of tons there. Individually, those companies are not liable to have to make a declaration. But yeah, you've got to basically still be aware of what's going on in the group. And yeah, there are going to be ways of making group declarations as well. So if you have lots of liable companies within the group, and they will have to make a submission, it looks as though there is going to be a way that you can sort of consolidate that into one declaration for the group rather than lots of little individual submissions. So I mentioned that there is a lot of talk, has been a lot of talk, especially in the last few months, around trying to define who the importer is. Say we sort of went to HMRC and said like the easiest way of defining who the importer is to look at the current Incoterms that companies buy on. So we're basically trying to follow the current Incoterm guidance to try and work out where the liability sits already, because obviously people are already paying different import duties and things when they buy goods into the UK. So it would make sense to align the plastic tax point of liability to the Incoterms, because that would make the most sense to UK businesses. That's what we think anyway. But yeah, obviously the one little nuance that we've got is the regulations state that the liability rests with the business upon whose behalf the plastic packaging is imported into the UK, which is a little bit different to saying it sits with the importer, which is what we have under the current packaging waste regulations, which people have been dealing with for the last 20 years. So it's trying to basically work out that nuance and trying to make sure that, yeah, we're 100% on all these different Incoterms, because there's about 14, 15 different Incoterms that companies can buy product on. So what we've done here is we've just taken sort of the three what we think are probably the most common that people are buying plastic packaging in on from outside of the UK, just to try and clarify where we believe the tax liability is going to sit. So free carrier FCA. So normally here the seller will deliver the goods to a place nominated by the buyer. Then basically the buyer assumes any liability for the onward transportation of the goods from that point into the country of destination. So normally under FCA Incoterms, the buyer is the one that is paying any kind of imports, fees and duties as the items come into the UK. Therefore, we think under the FCA terms, then the buyer is the one that's going to be likely liable for paying the plastic tax liability in the UK. So if you're the UK buyer in that instance, you would be the liable party. Next up, we've got delivery duty paid. So this one's a little bit different, because under DDP terms, normally the seller has legal title to the goods and is therefore responsible for paying all the duties and costs associated with the transportation, right the way up to the delivery of the goods to the buyer's premises. So what we anticipate under this buying scenario is that the seller, so that could be an overseas company, as we'll see, overseas companies can register and pay the tax provided they've got a UK resident or somebody to act on their behalf if they're not already based in the UK. But what we think under DDP terms is it's going to be the overseas seller that is responsible, therefore, for paying the tax liability, because they are already the company that is paying for all the tax and duties on the import under this term already. Finally, we've got free on board shipments. So free on board, again, similar to the FCA agreement that we were looking at before. Normally, the seller is the one that's responsible for the costs and liabilities until the goods are actually loaded onto a nominated vessel, so nominated by the buyer. That vessel then comes to the UK, and at that point, the goods have essentially transferred ownership to the buyer. So as they pass through customs, all the duties and things are getting paid by the UK buyer. So again, in that instance, we anticipate that the tax liability for this is going to sit with the UK buyer rather than the overseas seller. So those are three of the more common terms. Obviously, there are good, as I say, we've got 14 or 15 different Incoterms that people can buy on. Say Valpak, we have actually produced a document to help our members that basically outlines our interpretation of each one. So if anybody is interested about that, then yeah, let us know. We should be able to spread that document around as well. Okay, so important to note, as well as the direct liability. So we've been talking about those that are going to have to register with HMRC and make the declarations, that being those manufacturers in the UK, the importers of record in the UK. But you've also got to bear in mind that there is secondary legislation that is being implemented by HMRC alongside the main sort of primary legislation for the plastic tax that is going to try and enforce what they call joint and several liability on people involved within plastic supply chains. What this basically means is that if you are a customer of a liable business, then you're going to be expected to conduct due diligence within that supply chain to ensure that your supplier has paid the tax when they're supposed to. If they haven't, and it's deemed that basically you haven't done the due diligence work you were supposed to do, and you've been buying plastic packaging off somebody that should have been paying the tax and they haven't been, then HMRC will potentially try and hold not just the original liable company liable, but they're also going to try and hold you as the customer liable as well. So this is a way basically of trying to enforce that due diligence process to make sure that companies are checking when they're buying plastic packaging in the UK that the tax has definitely been paid on it, should it be paid, and basically making sure that nothing slips through the net. So yeah, it's worth bearing in mind, even if you're not an importer, even if you're not manufacturing plastic packaging yourselves, you do have to still be doing this joint liability piece where you look at your supply chain, you speak to your suppliers, and you basically make sure that your suppliers, if they are supposed to be paying the tax, are paying the tax. Now, the easiest way to see this would have been if there was some kind of statement on invoices and things like that, and that was going to be a requirement under the tax, but that did get thrown out towards the end of last year, at least at the initial implementation for April. Basically, UK businesses turned around and said there isn't enough time between this becoming a requirement and the tax coming into play to actually change invoicing systems to be able to evidence recycled, be able to evidence plastic tax on invoices. So it is something we think is going to come in further down the line at some point. Exactly what format it comes in, we don't know. Exactly what needs to be declared in invoices, we don't yet know. But it's just worth bearing in mind that it doesn't have to be on B2B invoices currently, but it probably will have to be in some regard further down the line. Okay, so in terms of what packaging is actually going to be taxable under the plastic tax, so as I mentioned before, when things are being manufactured in the UK, then the plastic packaging is, the components are only going to become taxable once they're deemed to be finished. So HMRC deem finished as being once the last substantial modification has been performed on the components, and HMRC lists the types of activities that they would expect to be performing last substantial modification as extrusion, molding, layering, forming, and printing packaging. So those are the types of things HMRC are considering to be finishing packaging. Anything that might happen after that point, they've listed activities such as blowing a preform, so bottles are quite usually supplied in smaller preform bottles that have to get blown to full size before they're filled with the product. So blowing a preform, cutting packaging to size or shape, labeling onto products, sealing packaging around a product. All of that is considered to be happening after the last substantial modification has been performed. So if you are a company that's performing any of those later activities, you are not deemed to be the manufacturer. The manufacturer is the company that's performing all of those earlier activities like extruding, molding, layering, so forth. So yeah, that's worth bearing in mind. That's where the line has been drawn essentially by HMRC on who is the converter and who is then just performing later activities that don't count as substantially modifying the packaging. The definition of packaging that we're using is almost word for word exactly the same as what we have under the current packaging waste submissions that people have been doing for the last 20 years. So it applies to any products that are designed to be capable for use within supply chain in containment, protection, handling, delivery, or presentation of goods. The bit that's a little bit different for the plastic tax is that sentence in green at the end, regardless of whether it's used in the supply chain or by consumers. Because what this does is it obligates items that historically we've not considered as packaging for the purpose of the packaging regulations. Things like sandwich bags, bin bags, plastic cups that are sold empty just to use as a product in the house. These types of things are going to be liable for the plastic tax because HMRC's argument is that they can be used as packaging by a consumer. So it's not necessarily just stuff that is being used as packaging with the supply chain. It can be things that are sold as a product and then go on to be used as packaging either within a supply chain or by a private consumer or an end user. So that's a really important thing to know because obviously there's lots and lots of tonnage of sort of refuse sacks and plastic cups and sandwich bags and things like that just a lot of people don't have data for because they've never had to collect that data before because it's not counted as packaging under our current submissions. That's just something to really be aware of. And basically, yeah, the scope of the tax is extending beyond the traditional interpretation of what the UK industry is considered as packaging. So just moving on to looking at a few exemptions. So not all packaging is going to be liable for this. There are a few listed exemptions. As I mentioned before, 1st of April 2022 is the implementation date. So that basically means any plastic packaging that is being imported into the UK or made in the UK prior to that date is not going to be subject to the tax. We also know that any unmodified cellulose-based material is going to be exempt. Now, that doesn't extend to bioplastics, biodegradable plastics, and things like that. They are still going to be covered by the tax. It's only unmodified cellulose-based materials that are going to be exempted. We then have 4 what we call use-specific exemptions. So that one at the top is probably going to apply to a fair bit of packaging in the UK. It's any packaging that is in direct contact with human medicinal products. So anything that is basically classified as a human medicine, so has to have a license essentially from the medicine licensing agency. Anything that falls into that category and is in direct contact with the medicine at the point that it's sold. So talking about things like tablet bottles and things like that, where the tablets are kept in the bottle. Obviously, the tablets are in contact with the bottle; they're in contact with the lid. So those 2 packaging components, if they are being used to package human medicines, is going to be exempt from the tax. The next exemption is any item that contains any sort of non-perishable or consumable goods at the point of sale that preserves them throughout a significant life cycle. So under the current packaging waste regulations, we call this exemption long-term storage. It's going to apply to things like toolboxes, CD and DVD cases, glasses cases, basically things that, yes, are performing a packaging function, but they are packaging something that is going to last for many, many years. It's not designed as disposable packaging where you take all the tools out of the toolbox and throw the toolbox away. Obviously, the intention is that you keep the tools in the toolbox in your garage or your shed for many, many years. So that is an exemption that, again, could apply to a fairly significant amount of plastic packaging or things that we deem to be plastic packaging. The next one is any packaging that is deemed to be integral to the use of the good that it contains. Now, again, this is kind of a mirror image of an exemption that we have under the current packaging regulations, where basically if a piece of packaging is performing a function beyond packaging, so if it is essential to the function of the good that it contains. So HMRC have given examples of things like printer ink cartridges, room deodorizers, lighters. So if you imagine a lighter, yes, it's packaging the lighter fluid, but without the ignition function of the lighter as well, it's essentially useless. So that is why those types of items are going to be considered exempt, because they are performing a function that is beyond just packaging, and therefore they are integral to the use of the good that it contains. Now, this is probably one of the biggest grey areas that we've got at the minute, because you could apply this exemption to so many different things. We've had lots of businesses come into us in the last few months saying, well, my bottles of water are integral to the use of the product, because how else do you buy and consume the water if it's not in a bottle? Obviously, that's not the intention. The intention is that most packaging items are going to fall under this, or fall under the liability for the tax. It's only very specific things that are going to be deemed to be integral to the use of the good that it contains. So we'll expect to see that list of items get expanded over time. Say HMRC's guidance pages are constantly getting updated, and the lists of exemptions continue to grow when they encounter different scenarios and different examples that get presented to them. The final use exemption is any reusable items designated for the presentation of goods. So this is going to apply to things like plastic display stands, shelf-ready packaging that goes out, gets used up, and then comes back to be refilled. Basically anything that's going around in like a returnable system that is designated for the presentation of goods. So that's a bit more of a narrow exemption, so that there's not a massive amount of things that are going to fall under there, we don't think. Another big exemption for the tax is what HMRC deem to be transport packaging which is in use around imported goods. So the definition for this is any packaging which is facilitating the handling or transportation and prevents damage of a number of sales units or grouped packaging. So the easiest example to think of here is sort of pallet wrapping. So if you are buying a pallet load of product from overseas, it's obviously coming into the UK. Ordinarily, that pallet of product is going to be secured with a load of pallet wrap around the pallet. So that pallet wrap is transport packaging, because it's been used to group together to help to handle and transport many, many different sales units. So that's the type of thing we're talking about here that's exempt. It's basically sort of mainly it's going to be things like plastic pallets and then the wrapping that goes around pallets as well. So this is quite a big exemption. So we know from looking at sort of years and years worth of packaging data submissions, companies have this quite a lot on their data submissions. So yeah, imported transport packaging that is in use around goods is going to be exempted from the tax. Now, if you're importing transport packaging as a product, so let's say you're buying in rolls of shrink wrap that are either then going to get sold on because you're a packaging merchant, or you're importing those to then use them in your own packing operation, well, those rolls of shrink wrap, say they're not in use around imported goods, they're imported as a product. So they are going to be liable for the tax. It's only the stuff that is in use around imported goods to perform that kind of handling and transportation job that is going to be subject to the exemption. We also know that any tax that is due on exported primary and secondary packaging is going to be relieved or refunded as well. So we'll cover that in a bit more detail in a slide or two's time. But essentially what we're looking at is any primary or secondary level packaging that has been exported out of the UK. The intention is that you don't actually end up paying the tax liability on it. As we'll see, there are certain scenarios where you might have to initially declare it. So if it comes into the UK and you don't necessarily know where it's going to end up, you have to declare it initially in a plastic tax submission. But then if further down the line it has been exported, there are going to be ways of claiming tax refunds on stuff that came into the UK or got made in the UK and then subsequently got exported back out again. So appreciate there's probably quite a lot of detail on this slide really for not many words, but that table down at the bottom kind of sums up the various different scenarios. So obviously anything that is within the UK, whether it is imported or made before the 1st of April, doesn't matter what layer of packaging it is, it's not going to be subject to the tax. Anything that is produced in the UK after the 1st of April, regardless of whether it's primary, secondary or tertiary, transit, transport packaging, whatever you want to call it, the outer layer, then that is going to be subject to the tax. Anything that's imported into the UK, whether it's primary or secondary, after the 1st of April is going to be subject to the tax, but not that tertiary transit transport packaging that is in use around imported goods, as we were just discussing. And then when packaging is exported back out of the country, if it's primary or secondary layer, then you should be able to either claim an exemption or basically defer the payment of the tax if you've always known that it was going to be subject to export when it came into the country. But important to know that exported tertiary transit transport packaging is not going to be refunded. So any exported transit packaging, you're not going to be able to claim tax credits on in the future. So just to go into those export scenarios in a little bit more detail. So as I mentioned, there's going to be this sort of 12-month deferral period for any packaging that is either produced or imported into the UK, which has basically always been destined for exports. If you are buying products into the country and you know at the point you're buying it and it's coming into the country that you're going to be exporting it further down the line and you can back that up, then you're not going to have to include that on a declaration, basically. So if within that 12-month period you know it's going to end up being exported, then you don't declare it, you don't pay any tax on it, and it's not going to touch your declarations that you make to HMRC. So the intention here is it's always going to have to be intended for export at all times since it got produced or imported. So again, say we've spoken to some companies where they operate like that. They know that they've got a certain production run that is destined for export, or they're buying in a particular type of product that they know is always going to be exported because that's just who the customer is. In that case, say as long as you can back that up and the export is going to be happening within that 12-month deferral period, then you don't declare it in a submission and you don't have to pay any tax liability on it. Now, the tax will become due if that 12-month period basically goes past and the packaging is still in the UK. So if you initially didn't declare it because you thought it was going outside of the UK, but then 12 months down the line it's still in the country, well then at that point HMRC are going to ask you to pick that up in a declaration. So you're going to have to be quite careful here. You're going to be able to track what packaging is coming in, where it's going and when it's going as well, if you have lots of sort of incoming and outgoing from import to export. You're also going to be able to claim credits on any packaging that you initially declared but has then ended up being exported. So this is how most companies operate from speaking to them. Say it's rare that you actually are sort of buying things or making things specifically for export. It's probably more likely that you are importing and making things. It's going into general stocks, and then at some point, based on customer demand, it's either going to go to the UK or it's going to go to export. So you would have had to have initially declared that material when it got manufactured or imported. But if up to 2 years after the initial manufacture or import, then those items have actually then gone to export, you are going to be able to claim tax back. So there's going to be a way on the declarations that you're going to be making to HMRC where you can declare that yes, there was some tonnage that you declared previously as liable packaging, but you can now prove that that has actually gone overseas, and you can therefore deduct that tonnage from your future tax liability and in effect claim a tax credit by not paying for that, for basically not paying an equivalent amount of tonnage in that declaration. So it's important to note that liable business, you still have to declare the weight of all non-exempt packaging that's manufactured or imported during the relevant quarter, even if the tax is not due. So even if all of your packaging has over 30% recycled content or is always due for export, you're still going to have to make declarations. It's just there are going to be different areas of the declarations where you have to put those figures. So from what we understand, say the online platform that people are going to be making these declarations on, again, we'll talk about that in a bit as well, but we've not really had eyes on that yet to see exactly what these inputs are going to look like. But from what we understand, there is going to be sort of 8 or 9 different numbers that a company is going to be expected to generate. So liable plastic packaging, non-liable plastic packaging, things subject to different exemptions, things that are subject to that export exemption as we just discussed. So you're going to have a fair breakdown in the numbers that you submit, but you are, even if all of your packaging is being exported, or even if all of it has 30% or more recycled content, you are still going to have to make a declaration, even if it results in zero liability to pay to HMRC. So in terms of making those returns to HMRC, so liable businesses, you're going to be expected to register with HMRC on their online portal when that goes live in April. So that is, say, only a couple of months away now. A couple of weeks away now. So when that portal goes live, HMRC are going to expect liable businesses to log into it and basically register their intention to start making these declarations. I mentioned before that we could have non-UK taxpayers that are going to be liable for this tax. If they are liable, i.e. they are one of those companies that's selling into the UK on DDP terms as an example, then if they don't have any UK presence, they're going to have to appoint a UK resident to act as their tax representative, because they are, say, as we currently understand, the ones that are going to be liable to pay that tax. As I mentioned on the previous slide, you're still going to have to register and make declarations, even if all of your plastic packaging has 30% or more recycled content or is subject to one of the exemptions that we've discussed today. You're still going to have to produce the figures, submit something to HMRC. It's just going to basically result in a zero payment for you if everything is exempt or has that recycled content in there. The quarterly declarations are going to follow the following period. So it's basically going to follow financial quarters. So as I said, that first submission that businesses are going to have to make in July, you're going to be declaring everything that you manufactured or imported in April through to the end of June this year. And then, by what we've seen, all the figures on these declarations are going to have to be made in kilos. So again, that's a bit of a departure from what companies are going to be used to declaring in the current packaging submissions, where we declare in tons. But yes, it looks as though all these submissions have to be declared down to the nearest kilogram. As I mentioned, so we've not really had sight on the actual submittal platform yet, so we don't know exactly for sure what format it's going to take, but we have got guidance from HMRC that tells us the figures that they're going to be able to, or going to expect companies to be able to produce for the submissions. So we know that people are going to have to declare the total weight of plastic packaging either imported or manufactured in the quarter. So you're going to have to factor in things like all that transport packaging around imported goods we were talking about, which are going to be exempt. Say anything that is subject to that 12-month export deferral period that we were talking about is not going to go into that starting number. But yeah, any components to which the direct export condition no longer applies, so anything that you imported 12 months ago was destined for export but actually hasn't gone to export, that's going to have to get picked up in that first total number that you declare on the submission. You then have to declare the total weight of any plastic packaging the tax isn't due on. So again, this is what I was talking about before. Even if all of your plastic packaging has that 30% recycled content there, or it's all human medicinal packaging that's in immediate contact with a medicine, you still have to declare this tonnage. So there's still going to be an area of the submission form where you declare all of this. It's just going to be in a category that doesn't actually result in having a tax liability applied to it. You're then going to be able to declare the total value of any tax credits that you're netting off your payment. So as I mentioned before, any exported plastic that you can now show you previously declared but has now actually gone to export, you're going to be able to basically deduct that off your current declaration to give yourself a bit of a credit. And then obviously all these numbers are going to add up then to the total amount of tax due. And then from what we understand, you're going to have a month from the date that you make your declaration to then actually pay that tax liability to HMRC. From what we understand, agents will be able to, you can use agents essentially to submit these returns. It's something, as we'll talk about at the end, that we are exploring doing. So say we'll be able to help companies with data submissions. We also want to be able to help them actually making the declarations to HMRC themselves. So that is something we are currently going through the process with HMRC at the minute. But yeah, from what we understand, agents, third parties will be able to act on your behalf and make these declarations to HMRC, provided they have all the right accreditations and they follow the right processes. And we also know that corrections will be allowed to be made as well. So within 2 years of the initial date of the returns being made, businesses will be able to go back and make adjustments. So if you've made a mistake previously, I don't know, maybe there was something that did have recycled content at the time, you couldn't prove it, but now you can go back and you can make adjustments within 2 years of the initial date that you made your declarations previously. Now, HMRC have basically given a bit of guidance on what kind of evidence documentation they're going to expect behind these submissions. Obviously, this is going to have to be heavily auditable. So we don't yet really know how this is going to be audited, whether HMRC themselves will get involved in auditing this, whether it's a function that's going to be devolved to your general tax auditors. So when you have your annual audit, this might be something that gets picked up in that. We don't yet really know how it's going to be audited or who's going to be auditing, but we do know that you're going to have an audit trail to the figures that you're submitting. And as we talked about before, the key bit of evidence you're going to need if you're claiming exemptions for recycled content is the evidence of recycled content, all those documents we're talking about, whether it's certificates of conformity, purchase orders, sales orders, and things like that. You're going to have something on file to show that you are making correct deductions for recycled content, but you also need to back up the weights and the figures that you're using to produce these numbers. So again, those companies that have been making submissions into the current packaging regulations for the last couple of decades, you're going to be aware of the data gathering you need to do and what you need to hold on file for the audits. But basically, you're going to need to have a breakdown of the weight of plastic packaging components that you're either manufacturing or importing. You have to have the weight of the plastic packaging exported on which the tax was previously being deferred, as we were talking about before for that tax exemption. You're going to have a breakdown by weight of any plastic packaging for which credits are being claimed, and then any adjustments or corrections to previous accounting periods. You're going to have all the records behind that as well. So as I said before, exactly how this gets audited is still something that's a bit up in the air and we don't really know, but you are going to be able to have to back up all of those numbers, all of those figures, all of those assumptions that you're making in your returns that you then send to HMRC. Just as an aside, from what we've seen, we don't think you're going to have to upload any of this evidence at the point you make the declarations. We think this is just going to have to be something you have to retain internally for that audit procedure, whatever that is in the future. So it's not as if you're going to have to be uploading thousands and thousands of evidence documents for each of your plastic components as you do the submissions. We think it is going to have to be something you're just going to have access to, have on file, and then say whoever it is that ends up doing these audits is going to be the one that checks that when they come and conduct the audits. Okay, getting towards the end now, so just looking at the remaining timelines. As I mentioned before, not really a lot now left to go. So we've got next month, that implementation date of the 1st of April. That is when HMRC are hoping their online portal will then open for registrations, and when they're going to ask companies that are going to be liable to first log in and register themselves, ready to start making those first tax declarations. And as we've been talking about, that first one then becomes due in July. So in July, that is the first time a business will have to log into that platform and start submitting data, and you'll be submitting everything you've manufactured or imported in April, May, and June 2022. So obviously there are still a few things to be determined as we've been talking about today. So there's still ongoing discussions every day with HMRC. There's still lots of webinars and sort of lots of working groups that are discussing various different technical nuances. Say one of the big ones at the minute is whether chemically recycled feedstock will be able to count as recycled content. Basically, I don't go into the detail now because it's far too technical, but basically the calculation behind how you come to the recycled content in a plastic component, basically using recycled feedstock can kind of break that calculation a little bit. So we think the intention is that chemically recycled plastic should be able to count as recycled content. But yeah, HMRC are seeking further industry engagement as to the best way to be able to use that essentially and demonstrate it. I mentioned that you've got this B2B invoicing declaration requirement, which was going to be coming in at implementation, but that's now been thrown out. It is something HMRC are keen to bring in further down the line, but we don't really know when it's going to come into effect, and we don't know exactly what needs to be on those B2B invoices to show when tax has been paid. We also obviously, so we have that 30% threshold, the £200 levy. A lot of companies keep asking, are those going to be increased over time? Again, don't know. I suspect if HMRC want to expand the scope of the tax, then those are the two easiest things they could increase. They could increase the amount of plastic that has to be, or amount of recycled content that has to be in a component to qualify as recycled content, or they can up the actual levy to try and encourage people to go and source more recycled content as well. So yeah, there's nothing actually set in stone yet, but yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if something in terms of increased threshold or increased levy comes in further down the line. A lot of businesses have been asking what is considered as good practice in relation to basically that due diligence piece in checking that your suppliers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So HMRC basically come back and said they do not provide a list of checks that must be carried out, but we are expecting that sort of the documents and the liability, at least every 12 months as a minimum, we think good businesses are going to be expected to basically check those and update them if required. So I speak to a lot of companies that are already going out there, speaking to their suppliers, trying to get statements out of them that they're aware of the tax and they're going to be paying the tax when it does come into force later this year. So that is something you can be doing already, say starting those conversations with your suppliers to make sure that you're not going to get caught out by that joint liability piece. And as we just discussed before, we don't really know what the audit plan for this is as of yet. We don't know who it is that's going to be auditing, the frequency, the style of audit. Is it going to be sort of systematic where everybody gets audited over a certain period of time? Is it going to be sort of like more random checks that get conducted on sort of randomly selected companies? All of that, I'm afraid, at the minute, we can't give you too much clarity on because we're still in debates with HMRC about all that detail. Okay, finally, just to take you through what we are doing to help companies with the plastic tax. So we run events. So we're doing this one for Business Wales today. So we've been doing ones for our members, and we've been doing bespoke sessions as well for companies that have come to us over the last few months to ask for help. So we can always do that. We can run consulting days where we come onto a business's site and look around and basically try and give you a bit of an idea as to what we think the scope of the tax is going to be for your business. But kind of the main service that we're providing is an expansion of our data service that we've been offering for packaging data for the last couple of decades now. So we already do packaging data submissions for about 300 UK companies. So it's not much of a step for us to be able to expand that to also basically include the scope of the plastic tax. So if we are already going out and speaking to someone's suppliers and gathering packaging metrics and packaging weights to do the current packaging submissions, well, then we can just expand that data gathering to get the little bit of extra information that we're going to need in order to produce the plastic tax submissions. So determining the recycled content in those plastic components, obtaining and collating all the evidence documentation to back up that recycled content. So we're going to be gathering all of that in from suppliers when they can provide it as well. We'll be using all of that data, using all of the evidence then to compile the data submissions that people are going to need to make the declarations to HMRC. I mentioned before how we are sort of still then looking at being able to make those declarations on behalf of a client as well. So that's something we're in discussions with HMRC about currently. But yeah, hopefully we'll be able to offer a solution where somebody can outsource the entire process to us, all the way from gathering the data, producing the numbers, and then actually making the declarations to HMRC on your behalf. Finally, because of the sheer amount of data that we hold, we're also in quite a unique position to be able to assess how you sit versus the rest of the market, have a look at where your sort of top liable products are, what kind of items are they, what kind of packaging components are they, where are they coming from. We can really assess where your impact is, and then start to make suggestions as to how you reduce that as well. So again, that's something we've been doing for the current packaging regulations for many years now. Say we're probably the biggest packaging data handler in the UK. We've got a database that's got some 30 odd million SKUs worth of data. We can use that database to start trying to show what does best practice look like. What kind of easy wins have you got within your product portfolio? Where can you be speaking to suppliers, looking at particular kinds of products and components to start making these reductions in order to lower your tax liability? So again, that's something that we've already started to work on for some companies. Okay, and that's brought us to the end of the session. So thank you for your time. So appreciate that's probably a lot of information for those of you where this is brand new. Say it has been around for a couple of years now. In the pipelines, hopefully it's not a massive new thing that you've heard about today, but giving you a few ideas. So thank you very much, everyone.
Diolch yn fawr, Lee. Thank you very much to Lee for that. The session was called a deep dive into the, I'm going to call it PPT because it's much easier, and it definitely was. Lots of information there, so it's really good to know how much support there is available for companies out there to kind of find out more. Unfortunately, Lee can't be with us for the question and answer session now, but we do have George Atkinson from Valpak, who's going to be joining us. George is also with us for the two of this afternoon sessions, and I'm delighted also to say that Denise Welby and Mark Palmer from HMRC are with us. Prynhawn da chi gyd, croeso cynnes. We've had a few questions, but if you do want to send some more questions, please do. The first one we've had is, so if my business just buys and uses packaging from a UK supplier, do we have any liability? Who would like to answer that one?
I can take that, and that's a nice, easy one to start with. So thank you very much, and it's good to be here. Thanks for having us. If you are buying plastic packaging from another UK business, they themselves will have manufactured or imported it, or indeed bought it for somebody else, you will not have any plastic packaging tax liability. The only thing I would say, as with all tax matters, there is a general due diligence liability, and if you are buying something that's so cheap it's too good to be true, and you suspect that's because the tax hasn't been paid, you could end up sharing that liability, but that's unlikely to be the case obviously with legitimate transactions. So if you're buying within the UK, then no, you won't have any liability. The only other exception is if you carry out a further modification on that packaging yourself, a further substantial modification to make a new component, when you might have to pay some plastic packaging tax on that new component.
Thank you very much, Mark. Just had a question come in. So what are the implications when it comes to charities?
The tax is for commercial use of plastic packaging. So it would depend if the charity is using the plastic packaging for commercials. It's a good question. It's not one I'm entirely sure I can say anything more about off the top of my head, but the tax is very much set up. It's for plastic packaging imported or manufactured for a commercial use. So certainly if a charity was making toys to sell in its shop or something of that nature, that would count as a commercial use, I would imagine.
Okay, well, I'll see whether Kieran comes back to us with anything about that. Does anyone else, George or Denise, would you like to answer the question about the charities or the implications?
No, agree with
Denise,
Mark,
unless you will. No, equally, just like Mark, that isn't something that we've typically got a lot of queries on recently.
Okay, brilliant. Next question. So do businesses under 10 tons still need to register?
They don't need to register, no, but they do need to keep records sufficient to show that they're under 10 tons, and obviously to make sure they know if they go over 10 tons, so that they do have to register. Okay,
so under 10, no need to register, but just keep an eye on it if they think they're going to go over, yeah?
Exactly, yeah.
Okey-doke. Do I need to pay tax on packaging that'll be exported?
Denise, do you want to?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So there are two aspects to this. So if you've manufactured or imported packaging into the UK and you are yourself going to export that packaging out of the UK, you can defer the tax on your tax return. There will be a section to be able to put that information in. The other alternative is you can pay the tax up front when you've imported or manufactured it into the UK, and then once it's exported, export as actually happened in that quarter, you can then deduct that off your liability for that quarter.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much, Denise. When will I first need to submit data? Another question.
Well, the first return will cover April, May, June of this year and will be due in by the end of July. So if you're required to register at any point between the 1st of April and the 30th of June, your first return will cover the period up to the 30th of June, and you will have to get it in by the end of July.
Okie doke. And I think...
Can I just come in on that, please, Sean?
Of course.
I just, Mark, Denise, I think it would also be helpful to let attendees be aware of sort of the window that liable businesses have to correct any returns, as well as the payment of any interest on those corrections. Would you mind clarifying that?
Off the top of my head, you should make a correction as on the next return as soon as you know about it. I don't know the answer to exactly when you'd start incurring interest or penalties off the top of my head, I'm afraid. Denise, do you know anything more on that one, or is that something we can look into and come back on?
Sorry, I'm just checking that, yeah. So correcting an error in a previous return. So if you submit a return that includes incorrect information, you should correct it as soon as possible, like Mark says, and within 4 years from the date to the due date of the tax return, which needs correcting. But we will be providing a bit more information about this soon. And if you may be charged penalties if you don't submit your return or pay the tax in time. You'll be charged interest on late payments. Late payment interest is calculated on the outstanding tax from the date the amount became due, and payable to the date the amount is actually paid. Is that okay, George?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you, guys. Certainly, we've had some of Valpac's members express a concern that they might not be able to get all of the information, but at least then they're able to correct where, to the best of their knowledge, the return might need amending at some point after its deadline.
Sure, I appreciate that. I mean, what I would say is for the initial months of the tax, we are looking to work with businesses to get it right. And we're looking for people to use their best endeavours to do the best they can to comply. And if you're doing that, you're not going to have anything to worry about. That's not to excuse deliberate malpractice or abuse or avoidance, of course, which we will continue to take action on. But we want to work with businesses to get it right rather than starting issuing penalties from day one to anybody and everybody. It's about working together to get this right, so we all get the environmental benefits of the tax.
Excellent. That's very good to know. I don't think we've got any more questions coming for the moment, but just so if companies do need more support, George, they can book one-to-one sessions with a Valpac expert, for bespoke advice about business. For more information, we're suggesting that attendees go to businesswales.gov.wales/green ambition, to find out more. I don't think we've got any more questions. So basically, if you do want to see what else we're offering during this series, if you click on the agenda tab in Event Box, you can see which topics will be covered, when and at what time. We're back at 2 o'clock this afternoon. George is with us again. We're going to be looking at extended producer responsibility. We also have a second session this afternoon, which is about deposit rental schemes. Rydyn ni nôl am 2 pnawn, mae George nôl gyda ni. Ni'n mynd i edrych ar gyfrifoldeb estynedig cynhyrchwyr, a wedyn yn hwyrach am 4 cynlluniau dychwelyd blaendal. I'm learning so much Welsh, all the Welsh terms today. But thank you very much to all of you for joining us for the question and answer session. We'll see you again later, George. But for now, and thank you to all of you who joined us this morning. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.